You know, I've done my fair share of camping trips, but there was one time, well, I'm not so sure I should even call it camping anymore. You ever get that feeling that something's watching you from out there in the dark? Something that knows your name? This story happened about 2 years ago, back when my friends and I were a little too brave, or maybe just plain stupid. We'd picked out this spot deep in the woods, far from anyone else. The whole point was to get away from it all, you know? Just us, a fire, some drinks, and a night under the stars. I mean, it sounded perfect. There were 4 of us. Me, Lee, Lisa, and Tua. We'd been planning this for weeks, talking about it at work and getting all hyped up. Lisa and Tua were a couple, so they took the bigger tent, and Lee and I shared one of those little 2-person deals. We parked the car about a mile from the campsite, loaded up our packs, and walked down this narrow trail. The woods were thick, tall trees, branches reaching out, and shadows everywhere, but we just laughed it off. Perfect horror movie setting, Tua had joked. If only we'd known, right? We got to the spot we'd picked out earlier. This little clearing right near a stream, perfect for a fire. We set up the tents, unpacked the snacks, and got the fire going. There's something about a campfire that just makes you feel safe, like nothing bad can happen while you're sitting around it. I guess we were clinging to that feeling a bit too hard. Anyway, the night started out great. We were telling stories, cracking jokes, and throwing more wood onto the fire as it got darker. The woods got quieter too, like the trees themselves were holding their breath, just listening to us. It was late, I think around midnight, when things started to feel wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the woods were suddenly started to feel different, like we weren't really alone out there, but we didn't think much of it. Lisa was in the middle of telling this silly ghost story when we heard it. A voice, distant but clear. "Lee?" We all froze. It wasn't just any voice, it was Lisa's voice, calling out like she was somewhere deep in the woods. Problem was, Lisa was sitting right there with us. She hadn't moved from her spot by the fire. The color drained from her face, and she looked at us like, "Did you guys hear that too?" We nodded. It was unmistakable. It was Lisa's voice calling out, sounding lost and far away. "Probably just an echo," Lee said, trying to brush it off, but I could see his hands were shaking a bit as he poked at the fire. "Out here sounds echo in weird ways." "Maybe," I said, but my gut told me something wasn't right. Then it happened again, this time louder. "Lee?" The same voice, the same pitch, and it was getting closer. We all turned and stared into the darkness, where the trees formed this black wall around us. There was nothing out there, no movement, no light, just pure darkness. "Who's messing with us?" Tua muttered, standing up. He tried to sound tough, but I could hear the unease in his voice. But none of us had an answer. We stayed huddled around the fire, clutching our jackets and waiting. And then, just when we thought it might be over, we heard it again, this time from the opposite direction. "Lee, help me!" The voice sounded desperate, almost like a plea. And yet, Lisa was still sitting there, trembling and staring into the fire. "All right, this isn't funny anymore," Lee said, standing up. He looked out into the woods, turning his flashlight on and off, like he couldn't decide if he really wanted to see what was out there. "Lee, don't," Lisa whispered. It's not me. I swear, I didn't leave the fire." I believed her, but that didn't make it any less disturbing. The woods were just so silent, like every creature out there had vanished, leaving only us to face whatever was calling. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I heard my own voice, faint and calling my name. "Help, please!" My voice, my exact tone, like it was me out there, lost in the dark. I felt my stomach turn. I hadn't moved, I hadn't said a word, and yet there it was, clear as day. I looked at the others, and they were staring back at me, wide-eyed. Lisa clutched Tua's arm, and even he looked pale, like he was realizing just how far out of our depth we really were. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered. Nobody answered. What could they say? We just sat there, frozen, like deer caught in headlights, waiting for whatever was coming next. But the voices didn't stop. They kept calling one by one, each time mimicking one of us. First it was Lee's voice, then Tua's, and then Lisa's again. They sounded just like us, like we were all out there in the woods, calling to each other, lost and helpless. Maybe it's just some kind of echo, Lee said, but his voice cracked, and I knew he didn't believe it. We sat like that for a while, barely breathing, listening to our own voices echo back to us from the dark. It was like we were haunting ourselves, and the longer it went on, the harder it was to stay calm. All right, this is ridiculous, Tua finally said, grabbing a flashlight. I'm going to see what's out there. Are you insane? Lisa whispered, clutching his arm. You don't know what's out there. He shrugged her off. I'm not just going to sit here and let some prankster mess with us. He took a step toward the woods, and we all watched him, too afraid to move. He aimed the flashlight into the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth, but there was nothing, just more trees, more shadows, and silence. He turned back to us, looking frustrated. See, there's nothing out there! Help! It was his voice this time, calling from somewhere deep in the woods. He froze, his face going pale. That's not possible, he whispered. We all sat there, our eyes darting back and forth, trying to figure out what was going on. And then, as if on cue, the voices all started up again, overlapping each other, louder and louder. It was like a choir of ourselves, begging and pleading, calling out for help, each voice twisted with fear. I don't like this, Lisa whispered, tears streaming down her face. She clutched at Tua, but he was frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the darkness. Then suddenly the voices stopped. Just silence. And that was somehow worse. We were all holding our breath, listening, waiting, terrified of what might come next. And then, I don't know why I did it, but I whispered, "Hello?" The woods seemed to listen, like they were waiting too. And then, in the quiet, I heard my own voice, soft, right behind me, whispering back, "Hello?" I whipped around, shining my flashlight everywhere, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows and us. We were the only ones there, but it didn't feel that way. Then, out of nowhere, Lee shouted, "Run!" He didn't explain. He didn't look back. He just bolted, sprinting away from the fire and into the dark. We didn't think. We just followed, scrambling over roots and branches, stumbling through the underbrush. The voices followed us, growing louder, closer, like they were right behind us, chasing us. "Please, help me!" one voice cried, sounding exactly like Lisa. "Don't leave me!" Another voice pleaded. It was Lee's, but he was right there in front of us, running like his life depended on it. We ran for what felt like hours, our lungs burning, our legs shaking, until finally we burst out of the trees and into the clearing where we'd parked the car. We didn't look back. We didn't say a word. We just piled in, slammed the doors, and took off down the road, not even caring which direction we were going. After we finally made it home, the silence between us wasn't normal. I think we all just wanted to forget what happened, but none of us could stop replaying it in our heads. It was a few days later when Lee finally called and said he needed to talk about it. I could hear it in his voice. He hadn't slept, same as the rest of us. We met up in my garage, the only place I could think of where we could talk about it without someone overhearing. Lee was sitting on an old crate, staring down at his hands, twisting his fingers like he was trying to wring something out of them. He looked rough, like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. "Lee, what happened out there?" I asked. "What did you see?" He took a deep breath, but his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Look, I didn't want to freak anyone out, but I saw something in the woods." My stomach dropped. We'd all heard those voices, but none of us had actually seen anything, or so I thought. I didn't think it was real at first, he went on, his eyes still locked on his hands. But when the voices started, I looked across the fire, and I saw us. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, saw us? He swallowed, his voice shaky. It was us, like duplicates. 4 people standing just beyond the trees, barely lit by the fire. They looked exactly like us, but they were wrong. Wrong? How? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He shuddered. Their faces weren't right. They were just a little off, like they'd been molded by someone who almost knew what we looked like, but not quite. They were grinning, all 4 of them, standing there like they were waiting for something. Their eyes, though, their eyes were blank, like empty, just staring right through me. I couldn't breathe. I could almost see it in my mind. Those creepy, grinning copies of us, staring out from the trees. Why didn't you tell us? I whispered. He looked up, his eyes haunted. Because I thought I was losing it. I was scared that if I pointed it out, they'd know we saw them, but then, one of them, it moved. Moved? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Lee nodded, gripping the edge of the crate like he was holding onto reality itself. Yeah. It reached out like it was beckoning me over, and then I heard it whisper, "Run!" But it wasn't warning us. It was mocking me, smiling with that awful, horrible face. I knew right then we had to get out of there, and fast. The room felt ice cold. After that, we didn't talk about it again. Each of us tried to forget, to push it out of our heads, but I don't think any of us really could. After that night, we never went camping in the woods again. We didn't talk about it. Didn't even try to make a joke of it like we usually would. We all just knew. That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you did, check out more of my videos on the screens above or visit my channel for even more. Don't forget to subscribe for future updates. Stay safe and take care.